The void stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of blackness dotted with distant stars. The TSS Callahan drifted in silence, its engines now cold, its emergency beacon pulsing weakly like the heartbeat of something that should have been dead. There had been no distress call, no warning, just silence. A ship that should have reached its destination days ago now hung lifeless in space, alone. Except it wasn't. A sudden gasp shattered the stillness inside an escape pod buried within the ship's failing hull. Ensign Dominic Carter bolted upright, his breath ragged, chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. His mind scrambled for clarity, but the only thing that met him was a throbbing headache and the dim flickering of the emergency lighting around him. His fingers trembled as they found the release latch on his harness, unbuckling himself as his vision swam. He tried to force his thoughts into order. What happened? He reached for the pod's control panel, expecting to see the launch sequence completed. But the small screen in front of him flashed red with the same error message, repeating over and over. Launch failure. Pod still docked. His pulse quickened. He wasn't in space. The pod had never ejected. He was still inside the Callahan. But the ship had been compromised. The alarms, the chaotic evacuation. He remembered the power failures, the emergency lights flashing red, the crew shouting over the intercom. Then nothing. Blackness. He forced himself to breathe, his training kicking in despite the haze in his head. He needed to find out what happened, and more importantly, if anyone else was still alive. His hands found the manual override on the pod's hatch, twisting the lever until the door hissed open, revealing a dimly lit corridor stretching out in front of him. Silence. The ship groaned softly, the sound of meta-cooling and shifting engine stress, but there were no voices, no signs of movement. Only the dim glow of flickering emergency lights running along the floor, casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. His boots echoed unnaturally against the metal flooring as he stepped out, and the absence of sound felt heavy, pressing in on him like the weight of deep space itself. He moved cautiously down the corridor, his pulse pounding in his ears. The Callahan was a small engineering vessel, not built for combat or exploration, just a routine maintenance ship designed for orbiter repairs and station upkeep. It had a minimal crew, no more than 15 at full capacity. And yet as he walked through the empty hall views, it felt impossibly large. The darkness made the space seem endless, stretching into an abyss of unknown corridors. He reached for his communicator, tapping the button on his wrist console. Carter to bridge. Does anyone copy? Static. He swallowed, trying not to let the growing sense of unease take hold. He tried another channel. Engineering deck, anyone there? Silence. His flashlight flickered to life as he reached a junction, sweeping the dim beam over the walls. A maintenance panel was ajar, wires spilling from its broken casing as if something had turned through it in a hurry. Sparks crackled faintly from the exposed wiring, but there was no indication of an explosion, no sign of struggle, just damage. As though the ship had been abandoned. A sudden noise made him freeze. A faint tap. He turned sharply, the flashlight beam cutting through the dim corridor. The sound had come from behind him. He strained his ears, holding his breath, listening. Tap, tap, tap. Slow. Rhythmic. His throat tightened. His rational mind tried to explain it. Maybe it was a loose pipe, the ship's cooling systems shutting down irregularly. Maybe it was the hull settling, shifting. But every instinct in his body screamed otherwise. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and forced himself forward. The bridge. He needed to reach the bridge. If anyone had survived, they'd be there. If the ship's systems were still functional, he could find out what happened, send a distress call. His steps quickened, the tapping sound fading behind him. He moved past closed doors, some slightly ajar, revealing empty rooms beyond, crew quarters left untouched, personal belongings scattered, chairs tipped over as if the occupants had left in a hurry. But there were no bodies. No sign of life. Just absence. Then he saw it. His flashlight passed over the wall to his left, and something caught his eye, a set of scratches, deep and uneven, gouged into the meta surface as though made in desperation. He stepped closer, angling the light to read the jagged letters etched into the ship's bulkhead. It was never alone. A deep groan reverberated through the corridor, and the emergency lights flickered violently, plunging the hallway into near darkness for a split second before stabilizing again. Carter span around, flashlight raised, his breath sharp and uneven. The corridor behind him was empty. And yet for the first time since waking up, he felt certain of something. Carter moved cautiously through the darkened corridors of the TSS Callahan, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick shadows that clung to the walls like something alive. Every step felt heavier than the last, the silence pressing down on him as if the very ship itself was holding its breath. The tapping sound had stopped, but its presence lingered, echoing in his mind. He needed to find the bridge. If there was anyone left alive, if the ship's systems were still functioning, that was where he would find his answers. The walls of the ship seemed tighter than before, the dim emergency lighting casting jagged shadows that shifted with his every movement. He passed by empty crew quarters, doors, revealing untouched beds and scattered personal belongings. It was as if the crew had vanished in an instant, leaving no trace of panic or struggle, just absence. The strangeness of it gnawed at him. If there had been a catastrophic failure, there should have been bodies, signs of attempted evacuation. But there was nothing. He reached a control panel near a bulkhead door and pressed his fingers against the screen, hoping to get some information on ship diagnostics. The display flickered erratically, its text garbled and corrupted. He frowned, tapping a few commands into the system, trying to pull up logs or security footage. A few seconds later, the panel responded, flashing a broken feed of data logs. He skimmed through them quickly, looking for the last recorded entries. Ship status, partial system failure. Emergency basic active. Crew log last entry. Error. Data CURRUPTD. Security footage. Loading. The screen flickered, then stabilized into grainy, distorted footage from various parts of the ship. Carter's eyes narrowed as he saw the Callahan's hull views, captured in eerie stillness. The footage played in disjointed fragments, flickering between different times and angles. He spotted a crew member in van feed, walking hurriedly through a corridor, glancing over their shoulder as if they were being followed. The timestamp flashed and jumped. The same crew member reappeared, but now they were running. Their face was contorted in terror. Then, static. The screen jumped again. Carter's breath hitched as a figure moved at the very edge of the screen, barely visible in the flickering light. It was tall, hunched, its shape distorted and unnatural. He leaned closer, trying to make out the details, but the footage cut to black. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He knew what fear felt like, real fear, the kind that tightened in your chest and left you breathless. He stepped back from the screen, his instincts screaming at him to move. Whatever had happened here wasn't just a technical malfunction or a routine accident. The ship groaned as if in response to his thoughts, the meta walls creaking and an unseen pressure. The emergency lights flickered, casting brief moments of complete darkness. Carter turned sharply, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. He wasn't sure if it was just the flickering shadows playing tricks on his eyes, but for a split second, he thought he saw movement down the hallway. Something shifting just beyond the edge of his light. He forced himself forward, gripping the flashlight tighter. The bridge was close. He passed another set of corridors, pausing briefly when he noticed deep scratches in the meta floor. Not like the message he had seen earlier, these were longer, more erratic, as if something had dragged across the surface. His breathing quickened. He turned his head slowly, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might bust. The whispering grew louder. Carter took a step back, and the moment his boot hit the floor, the emergency lights above him cut out completely. His breathing turned shallow, his ears straining for any sound, any movement. The ship had gone silent again, but this time it felt different. The air itself felt heavier, thick with something unseen. His fingers fumbled for the backup power switch on his flashlight, and when it flicked on, his beam landed on something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood just within the reach of his light, its form wrong in a way that his brain couldn't immediately process. It was, but stretched, elongated, its arms too long, its head tilted unnaturally. It stood motionless as if waiting. Not in the way a person moved, not even in the way an animal might. It shifted, almost flickering, like a broken transmission skipping frames. One moment it was at the end of the hallway. The next it was closer. The whispering returned, growing louder, spiraling into a dozen overlapping voices. The flashlight flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, Carter knew it had moved closer still. His boots pounded against the metal floor, his breath ragged as he sprinted toward the bridge. The ship shuddered beneath him, groaning as if it was alive, as if it was reacting to the presence that now pursued him. The whispers followed, crawling into his ears like static, a voice, or many voices, repeating something he couldn't understand. The bridge doors were in sight. He slammed his fist against the emergency access panel, willing them to open faster. The moment they hissed apart, he threw himself inside and hit the override, sealing them shut behind him. His breath came in short gasps, his body trembling as he backed away from the entrance, his flashlight trained on the door. The bridge was a mess. The emergency lights flickered erratically, casting shifting shadows over shattered consoles and broken screens. Thick cables hung from the ceiling like dead vines, sparking occasionally with small bursts of failing electricity. The air was thick, stale, carrying the acrid scent of burned circuits and something else, something metallic and wrong. Carter's breath was uneven as he stood in the doorway, his flashlight sweeping over the wreckage. The ship had suffered, but the worst part wasn't the damage. It was the silence. The bridge should have been the safest place on the Callahan, the last refuge of command and control. Instead, it was a graveyard. Bodies sat motionless in their seats, strapped in as though still at their stations. The crew of the Callahan had died where they worked, their expressions frozen in unnatural horror. Their eyes were wide, their mouths open, some, as if something had terrified them in their final moments. But there were no signs of physical trauma, no gunshot wounds, no burns, no external injuries at all. They had just stopped. Carter forced himself to move forward, his boots crunching against broken glass from a shattered display. He checked one of the bodies, pressing 2 fingers against a cold, rigid wrist. No pulse. Not that he expected one. His stomach twisted. These people didn't die in an explosion. They weren't victims of a sudden decompression or a system failure. It was as if something had reached inside of them and stolen their life away in an instant. The whispering returned. It slithered through the bridge, low and distant at first, just a barely audible hum beneath the groaning metal of the ship. Carter froze. His fingers gripped the edge of a console as his pulse skyrocketed. The voices weren't coming from the comms. They weren't coming from the ship's speakers. They were coming from everywhere. He span toward the main command terminal. If there was anything left in the logs, anything that could explain what happened, it would be there. He wiped a slick sheen of sweat from his forehead before his fingers flew across the cracked keyboard, bypassing the ship's security lockouts with the efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. The system resisted at first, flashing corrupted data and fragmented text, but he pushed through. The recording started with static, then a ragged voice came through. It was the captain. If anyone finds this, don't stay. Get out. The ship is compromised. We were never alone. It lets you think you're alone, but you're not. A deep breath. A moment of silence. Then, we opened something we shouldn't have. Something that was never meant to be found. Carter's hands tightened into fists. He felt his heartbeat in his throat. Opened something? He scanned through the other files, searching for more, but most of them had been wiped. The only thing left intact was a security feed, video logs from the last moments of the Callahan. The first clip showed the engineering deck. The crew was gathered, working frantically at a console. There was no sound, but their body language was frantic, their movements rushed and desperate. The screen glitched, then cut to another angle, a hallway. A crew member sprinted past, looking back over their shoulder. Their face was twisted in sheer terror. The camera feed was jittery, distorted, but Carter could still make out what was happening. The crew was at their stations, tucking, moving, unaware of the thing standing in the far corner of the room. The thing was tall, its form flickering between solid and transparent, like a broken hologram. Its limbs were elongated, shifting in unnatural ways. The static on the feed thickened, and for a moment, its face, or what passed for a face, tilted toward the camera. Two dark wards where eyes should be. A mouth that stretched too wide. Chaos erupted. The crew turned, some scrambling out of their seats, others frozen in place. Their mouths opened in silent screams as the thing moved, no, not move, jump, flickering across the room in an instant. The camera cut to static. Carter pushed away from the console, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. The whispering grew louder, curling around him like cold fingers. He turned, his flashlight flickering against the darkness of the bridge. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and unnatural. He span, raising his light, but there was nothing there. Just empty space. The emergency lights flickered violently. The ship shuddered, the meta groaning like something was pressing against it. A distorted voice, garbled, barely more than static, whispered from the console speakers. He ran through the corridors, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The ship moved around him, the bulkheads groaning, the walls seeming to stretch and shift. The whispering was everywhere now, layered, overlapping, voices that didn't belong to the living. He reached the escape pod bay and slammed his hand against the control panel. The screen flashed, system error. Pod launch offline. The whispering crescendoed into a deafening chorus, and Carter forced himself not to turn around. He punched in the final sequence, and the escape pod door hissed open. He dove inside just as the pod sealed, slamming his fist against the emergency eject. The last thing he saw before being launched into the void was the Callahan, its corridors dark, its bridge silent, and the thing watching him from the escape pod's thrusters fired, hurling Carter into the void, away from the Callahan, away from the thing that had been watching him. The force of acceleration pinned him against the seat as the pod stabilized, its onboard systems kicking in with a mechanical hum. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had escaped. He had survived. Or at least, that was what he wanted to believe. The pod's small, framed the Callahan as it shrank in the distance. It hung in space like a drifting corpse, its hull darkened, lifeless. From this distance, the damage was barely visible, just a silent vessel abandoned in the endless void. And yet Carter couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him. The thing inside. The thing that had taken the crew. The thing that had whispered. He swallowed hard, pushing away the thoughts threatening to paralyze him. He needed to focus. He needed to send a distress signal, reach out to any Terran ships that might be close enough to intercept his pod. The console in front of him flickered to life as he accessed the emergency beacon. The system was intact. All he had to do was activate it. His fingers hovered over the control panel. A cold shiver ran through him. The whispering. Faint, distant, curling at the edges of his hearing like a dream. It wasn't possible. He was alone. He had left the Callahan behind. The pod was sealed, isolated, completely cut off from the ship. But the whispering was there, just below the hum of the pod's systems, like a voice pressed against the fabric of reality itself. Carter's breathing turned shallow. He glanced at the console, hoping for a sensor malfunction, some rational explanation. But the readings showed nothing out of the ordinary. The pod was secure. His heart pounded in his chest. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head toward the. At first, there was nothing but stars. Then, movement. His stomach twisted. A shape flickered in the void, just outside the pod, shifting, impossible. It wasn't attached to the Callahan. It wasn't floating debris. It was something else. His mind rebelled against what he was seeing. The thing was there and not there, flickering between existence and absence, slipping between dimensions like a shadow refusing to be cast. Carter forced himself to move. His hand slammed against the emergency beacon switch, sending out a desperate signal into the void. A repeating SOS pulse echoed from the pod's transmitter, a plea to any ship within range. His fingers trembled as he tried to regulate his breathing, to focus on the reality in front of him rather than the horror looming beyond the glass. But then the console flickered. The distress signal cut off. The pod's systems shut down in an instant. The emergency lights dimmed. The hum of machinery went silent. The only illumination came from the stars outside, casting a pale glow into the tiny space. His breath turned to mist in the growing cold. The pod had lost power, and the whispering was inside. It started softly, curling around him, filling the silence, each voice layered upon the last. It spoke in no language he could recognize, yet somehow he understood. It wasn't words, not really. It was intent. Hunger. Knowing. Carter gritted his teeth, fighting against the panic clawing at his mind. He pressed against the console, trying to manually restart the pod's systems, but the controls were dead. The darkness thickened. Then the glass froze. A thin layer of ice spread across the glass in intricate and natural patterns, as though something on the other side was breathing against it. The cold seeped into the pod, into his bones. His fingers ached as he curled them into fists, his breath shaking. Then, the whispering stopped. A single word, clear and unmistakable, spoken not in his ears, but in his mind. Open. Carter squeezed his eyes shut. No, he whispered. A sharp crack. His eyes snapped open as the glass split, a jagged fracture running down its center. A terrible silence filled the pod, heavier than before. He could feel it, something was coming through. His survival instincts kicked in. His hand slammed against the console, bypassing the standard restart protocols and forcing an emergency reboot. The pod's systems stuttered, lights flickering wildly as power surged back through the tiny vessel. The engines roared back to life, thrusters firing in an erratic burst. The ice on the shattered. Carter didn't wait. He engaged the pod's emergency thrust sequence, sending the vessel into a violent spin, pushing it as far away from the Callahan as possible. His body pressed against the seat as the pod accelerated, tearing itself from whatever force had been reaching for it. The whispering turned into a wail. The ship's warning alarms blared as the pod's speed reached dangerous levels, but Carter didn't care. He kept his hand locked on the controls, guiding the pod toward the nearest set of navigational coordinates. He didn't know if he was heading toward safety or deeper into the void, but he had to get away. The comms crackled suddenly. A voice, human, clear, cutting through the static. An identified escape pod. This is the TSS Vanguard. We've received your distress signal. Identify yourself. Carter's breath caught in his throat. He had made it. Someone had found him.